Yeah.
chatting with him.
Good evening, and thank you everyone for being here with us tonight for this meeting of our office's Anti-Hate, Anti-Racist Task Force. As you know, our topic for tonight is white supremacist strategic infiltration of law enforcement, understanding the threat. And I want to begin by thanking our permanent task force members. You are, as always, responsive and really leaders in this area. To our guests, for whom this is their first task force meeting, a very warm welcome. We launched this task force in 2020 as part of a multi-pronged office effort to really confront head-on issues of racial inequity in the criminal legal system. It includes leaders from every discipline, faith leaders, community leaders, our elected partners, and I want to particularly acknowledge tonight we have with us Representative Hagerty from Woburn, and it has really been a way for us to be a forum for expert-driven discussions about many different topics, such as incidents of racism and hate-driven criminal conduct that's occurred in our county's 54 cities and towns, issues of structural racism that may occur in the country's legal system, as well as really solutions to these kinds of incidents, how we remediate in a community, and issues that where we can prioritize harm reduction and be guided by the principles that we hold so important in this office, that being the restorative justice. I want to begin by saying a few words about why we are here tonight. As many of you know, last week our office became aware of the deeply disturbing allegations regarding a former officer that had served in a Middlesex municipality. And as we did that, we began to, first of all, we began to provide to anyone who had a case in which that officer was involved. We began providing discovery notices. We also posted that officer's alleged allegations on our list of officers who have exculpatory evidence disclosures. That's available to people. Making sure that both people in the cases had that information and public had access to that. You know, we hold sacred the prosecutorial obligation in our possession. And that does include information that may come to us about a police witness misconduct. And as both Professor Johnson and Agent German will talk about, that list is a critical piece of us being transparent about what we do. And we also have to be intentional about ensuring the fairness of our cases. It's one of the reasons why we have a conviction integrity unit in this office. And it's also why we were taking this action in this case. We are in the process, as I've said, really of going intentionally through any cases that the officer may have been involved in and making decisions about what we will do with those cases. And to do that right takes time. We don't want to miss anything, not just a case in which an arrest was made, but issues where there may have been search warrants or other things that happened. That process is ongoing. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking further tonight about that incident, nor should the title of this event be understood to suggest in any way that we have evidence one way or the other, whether this was a case of strategic infiltration of the department. Yet, I appreciate and understand the ways in which allegations and instances of this kind of behavior that come to light tear at the fabric of trust that exists between a police department and those communities which they serve. And in my view, the most productive use of our time tonight will be to have us have experts that we have join with us. Look at this frightening trend that is really starting to get the attention that it deserves. And we know the vast majority of men and women who comprise our county's police departments are honest, talented, tolerant, hardworking public servants. What we're talking about tonight is the small percentage of officers that have infiltrated police departments across the United States. And we know that even a tiny number of people being able to do that can wreak incredible damage, both from the harm that they can be inflicting on the citizens that they are sworn to serve, as well as the fact that they can share with groups that they might belong to confidential information that comes into their possession. They can also help members of those groups to evade capture and prosecution. And the frightening reality is that federal law enforcement authorities have recognized this since as early as 2006, that various white supremacist groups are intentionally and strategically engaged in efforts to infiltrate United States law enforcement. In 2006, the FBI issued a then classified intelligence assessment, which has since been declassified and we'll put in the chat for people who want to read it. And in that report, the FBI observed that, quote, having personnel within law enforcement agencies has historically been and will continue to be a desired asset. Just think about that for a second. For white supremacist groups seeking to anticipate law enforcement interest in and actions against them. In more recent years, many scholars and legislative leaders and members of law enforcement have tried to better understand this phenomenon and to craft solutions to this insider public safety threat. In September of 2020, for example, the United States Oversight House Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties held a hearing entitled White Supremacy in Blue, the Infiltration of Local Police Departments. That threat can't be ignored. It can't be taken lightly. And when one considers the really enormous obligations that come with the privilege of being a police officer, confronting this threat really requires a full government response. And to that end, we are incredibly grateful to have with us tonight two real experts in the field to talk through with us what it is that exists in this area, where we go with that, and also to help us understand that this is not a problem that exists in Massachusetts. It's not even a problem that exists just in this country. Just recently, you may have seen a lot of research published about the fact that Germany is dealing with this very same issue. We shared that article among our staff in really getting a sense of how the world is dealing with this problem. And I'm incredibly grateful, and I am particularly grateful given the timely way that we tried to turn around putting this panel together, to have our guests with us this evening who've taken time and will share their insights with us, both being really leaders in this field. And we have with us first Professor Vida Johnson, who's an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. And her scholarship and research has focused on the links between white supremacy and law enforcement and what we should and can do about it. Professor Johnson was a witness in that subcommittee hearing that I talked about in September of 2020 about how white supremacist views in law enforcement agencies can be harmful to Black and Brown communities. Prior to going to serving in Georgetown, she served as a supervising attorney in the trial division of the Public Defender's Service for the District of Columbia for 8 years, an incredibly busy office. She took on many serious cases, including homicide, sexual assault, and armed offenses. Professor Johnson earned her law degree from New York University in 2000 and her bachelor's degree in history from the University of California in Berkeley. We are also very fortunate to have with us a former federal agent, Michael Brennan, who comes to us from the Brennan Center and brings with him really incredible experience. He is a Brennan Justice Fellow at the Brennan Center and is a former FBI agent with lived experience of being undercover in this field and of exploring how it is that people can really get into these groups. He had the opportunity in the 1990s to spend years infiltrating the neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups, working undercover capacity in those groups. His work helped to prevent coming to fruition a number of plots. Today, Mr. German brings that depth of experience to his work, focusing on law enforcement, intelligence oversight, and reform. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, he served as policy counsel for national security and privacy for the American Civil Liberties Union, Washington Legislative Office. Mr. German wrote a report in August of 2020 about the connections between law enforcement officers and violent, racist, and militant groups. He noted that the FBI itself, again, as I said, as early as 2006, and again in 2015, was warning its agents assigned to domestic terrorism cases that the white supremacist groups they were investigating often had active links into law enforcement agencies. His report on this topic is thorough, it's sobering, and it's worth a review. It highlights that this is an issue that deserves urgent, aggressive action, that the civil rights, the freedom, and the lives of our fellow Americans are at stake and directly implicated by this issue. And it also speaks to the importance of addressing this widespread and national problem with transparency and public accountability. He wrote, quote, "Winning back public trust requires transparent and equal enforcement of the law, effective oversight, and public accountability that prioritizes targeted communities' interest." Mr. German's report provides a number of specific and tangible policy recommendations for federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. Mr. German is also the author of a number of books, and we'll put a list of those titles as well as some of Professor Johnson's scholarship in the text. And we are incredibly grateful to have both of them with us tonight to present important information, their scholarship, their lived work, and then to take questions. I offer to you all that we will take questions that you have at any point. You can put those in the chat, and as we finish, we'll go through those and we'll address those to our panelists. So thank you both, and we're going to begin with Professor Johnson.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be speaking with you today. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that although we'll be saying some things that are critical of police, I think the vast majority of police get into the work for all the right reasons, including members of my own family. So I know we're going to be talking about modern policing, but I want to just pause to acknowledge that there's a long history of explicit racism on police departments in the United States. The first police departments in the United States were groups of men who organized to police the comings and goings of enslaved people. We know that lynching was allowed by many a police department, with 3,000 people being lynched, sometimes on the courthouse lawns without a single arrest or prosecution. And if we go back only 25 years ago, there were scandals in police departments involving organized white supremacist groups. So in Los Angeles, there was organized white supremacist gangs that targeted Black and Latino residents in the sheriff's department there. In Cleveland, Ohio in 1999, there were Nazi symbols found in every precinct. Texas officers were fired after trying to recruit one more officer into their KKK chapter. My research is focused on 2008 till now, but I wanted to just make sure that we acknowledge that this isn't a new problem. I want to ground some of our conversation today in just some numbers that I think are useful to think about. So just after Charlottesville, and I know we'll be talking about that a bit today, there was an ABC poll that found that 10% of people told pollsters that they believed it was acceptable to hold neo-Nazi or white supremacist beliefs. And just after the January 6th insurrection, a similar poll was conducted, and about 11% of people align their views with far-right extremist views. So it's not hard to imagine that a similar number of law enforcement officers also feel that way. And we know that far-right extremism and racial violence has been going up in this country since 2008. So it shouldn't be a surprise that there may be law enforcement officers who hold these views. We know that white supremacists have been recruiting on college campuses, and we know they have been recruiting members of the military. And these are the two groups that most police departments recruit their officers from. And it's also important to think about the fact that modern policing, unfortunately, is very attractive to those who want to subjugate people of color. They get to police entire neighborhoods in some cities. They get to use physical violence. They're armed, and they get access to specialized training. As was already mentioned, we've known that this was a problem in the United States since 2006 of white supremacists trying to infiltrate police departments because of that FBI report. But as I mentioned, it goes on. We knew about this problem even beforehand. My research, some of the highlights were in 2014, members of a police department in Florida were outed as members of the KKK. In 2015, an Alabama officer was identified as being a member of the League of the South, another white supremacist organization. And also in 2015, a Louisiana officer was photographed at a KKK rally. In 2016, an officer in Philadelphia was seen with a number of Nazi tattoos, policing a Black Lives Matter protest, and he was not fired. In 2017, an Oklahoma police chief was discovered to be one of the most influential white supremacists in the country. He was the owner of a white supremacist website. He'd been in 2 documentaries about hate groups, actually owned a white supremacist record label, and could be seen in one of those videos wearing a t-shirt that said "Terror Machine." And I think it makes sense to focus on officers who are in organized white supremacist groups, but those aren't the only officers that we need to worry about. Because in addition to ones that are in white supremacist organizations, there are officers who may hold these beliefs, even if they're not in one of those groups. And that's one of the reasons that we worry about an officer coming onto the force who holds those views, because they run the risk of infecting other officers who may think that's just the police culture. We know from the Department of Justice reports on Ferguson and Chicago that the use of racial slurs like the N-word were very common there. And so that's just an example of how harmful it can be to hold explicitly racist views, even if you're not in a white supremacist group. That can be very hurtful to communities of color. So we know that there's no community that is safe. We've talked about a bunch of different places around the United States: north, south, east, west, rural, urban, sometimes high-ranking officers. And social media posts make plain that some of these views are shared, not just with people on the force, but with friends, family, and sometimes the public when they have public social media accounts. My research documented close to 200 instances of explicit racial bias by members of police in 48 states in the District of Columbia. And we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg. News articles really just get at a few of these stories, but not every officer is going to be as reckless as to post something on a public social media post or get photographed at a rally. We also know that confidentiality statutes in many states make police discipline private, and so not every police department shares this information. And I really do applaud our DA here, who is taking this step to really air this publicly and try to come up with solutions, and is already looking into all the cases that this officer has handled. But that isn't always the case, and so it's important that the public have access to this kind of information. And the other reason I think that these numbers are low is that the blue wall of silence protects officers. Other officers fail to report officers who they know are up to no good. And there's been a lot of scholarship about this, and just common knowledge that officers, because they have to rely on each other in the street, rarely tell supervisors when a fellow officer is involved in illegal or offensive behavior. We also have to worry about this kind of explicit racism and other types of bias on police departments, because we worry that it will translate into racist actions by those officers. We worry that officers will stop citizens due to their race. And for example, I've documented instances of police officers texting each other about stopping Black people on the highway. We worry that officers may plant evidence on people of color. And there's a story from Florida, I think it was Biscayne Bay, where the police chief there instructed his officers to pin all unsolved cases on people of color, Black people in particular. And we also worry, of course, most about violence. And the story that I often tell is about an officer in Little Rock, Arkansas, who was honest with the police during his background check and admitted that he'd been to a KKK rally when he was a teenager. They hired him anyway, thanked him for his honesty. Well, he later went on and killed a young, unarmed Black child there. And so, we're paying police officers salaries. They're public servants who are here to keep everyone safe. And because of that, their police are trusted with a lot of power. We give them weapons, access to sensitive information, they get specialized training, and they're the only Americans who are authorized to use force against other Americans. It's a lot of power and a lot of responsibility. And so we want to make sure that the people that we trust to keep us safe are people who deserve that trust. And so I look forward to all of your questions, and I'm happy to talk about what are some of the solutions, I think, but in the meantime, I'll let some other folks talk.
We'll move to Mr. German to talk a little bit. And I see we already have a number of questions, but maybe we can have more of a conversation.
Sure. And thanks very much for inviting me. And as you read some of my recommendations from my report, transparency about the issue is one of the ways that community trust can be restored. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this effort. My name is Mike German. I was an FBI agent from 1988 till 2004. And in the early 1990s, I was asked to go undercover into neo-Nazi groups operating in the Southern California area in the wake of the civil unrest following the police beating of Rodney King. So a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today, as Professor Johnson mentioned, are very old and are part of this, the fabric of our history, and continue to influence what's going on. The presence of racist and white supremacists and far-right militants within law enforcement has been a persistent problem. And it's been a long recognized problem within law enforcement. When I was going undercover, we were working with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which included officers from other federal agencies, from other state and local police departments. And early on in the operation, our supervisors brought us together and said, we have to be very careful with an operation like this, where we're putting an agent out into the community of white supremacists, because we know that there are sympathizers within law enforcement who might create a harm to the undercover agent. And that statement, even though people from all different agencies were in the room, wasn't contested. It wasn't as if people said, oh no, not my agency, we would never be influenced by that. It was just acknowledged that this was an issue and that we would have to be very careful, even sharing information within our own agencies about this operation. I left the FBI in 2004, and in 2006, this FBI memo that's already been mentioned was publicly released that basically gave voice to the warnings that I had received in the previous 10 years in these undercover operations. So it was something that was out in the open. In fact, the 2015 counterterrorism policy guide within the FBI went even further and suggested not just that there are white supremacists who might infiltrate law enforcement and that people in law enforcement might become enamored with that ideology and actually seek out white supremacist groups to join with or to associate with, but that the subjects of FBI domestic terrorism investigations, the people they are investigating for engaging in criminal activities on behalf of these groups, often have active links to law enforcement. And that's a pretty alarming statement. And in fact, in the policy guide, it warns the FBI agents working domestic terrorism investigations against white supremacists and far-right militants to avoid using all of the tools available to them in their counterterrorism toolbox, particularly the terrorist watch list, because other law enforcement officials have access to who's on the terrorist watch list. So they suggest that agents shouldn't use the terrorist watch list for their white supremacist subjects and instead use a subsystem called the silent hit that wouldn't reveal to local law enforcement, state, local, and federal law enforcement who's on the list. And I think that, even more so than the 2006 memo, highlights the risk that the FBI recognizes with this problem, that having white supremacist sympathizers and far-right militants within law enforcement creates a risk to law enforcement operations. So, often when we talk about this topic, there's a concern that we're being hypercritical of police, but this is a threat to police. This is a threat to other law enforcement officials as well as to the general public. And the deficiency I find in the FBI's approach is that while they take measures to protect their own investigations by limiting how they share information about domestic terrorism investigations, they don't actually have a policy for how they're going to protect the public from these officers who are influenced by white supremacists or far-right militant groups. And I think that is a major problem that has highlighted how deeply entrenched this is, not just in state and local law enforcement, but in the federal government as well. In fact, District Attorney Ryan had mentioned the hearing that Representative Raskin held in Congress on the topic of white supremacy in law enforcement. And he had asked the FBI to update that 2006 report and to appear at the hearing and testify about the problem that their analysts and agents were reporting. Behind closed doors, the FBI met with Mr. Raskin's staff and told him that they were going to disavow the 2006 report, that they did not believe that white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement was a significant problem, and they refused to testify at the hearing. This came out because after January 6th, when of course police officers were participating in the assault on the Capitol, including engaging in criminal acts that they've since been charged for, another FBI internal memo leaked, dated February of 2021, that basically reiterated what was in the 2006 report and highlighted exactly what Representative Raskin was asking for back in October. And that refusal of FBI management and willingness to disavow the intelligence produced by their own agents, I think highlights how deeply entrenched this problem is. So getting it out in the open like this is a critical element of it. And if you do a close read of that 2006 report, even though it's titled White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement, it makes clear that it's not just one-way infiltration. This isn't just a nefarious plot by white supremacists who try to join police agencies to get that training and the ability to use the law in a way to harm specific communities, but rather that it's part of our society. And, you know, as Professor Johnson mentioned, it infects all our institutions. It's not just law enforcement, it's the military, it's other aspects of our government, it's private companies. You know, there are all kinds of racial disparities in who has power in this country. And because police are recruiting from the population, it's really impossible not to recruit some people who hold these views. And so it's clearly a problem that will be persistent. This isn't something that we can do a one-time investigation and say, okay, we found the few bad apples and pulled them off the tree, and now we can just go back to doing business. This will need a constant attention to the issue. And often what I hear when I talk to law enforcement officials, they talk about the difficulty of trying to peer into the mind of their applicants and their officers to figure out who holds these dark and problematic views. But I would suggest that that's not where they should put their resources or their time or attention. Instead, you know, if there is a police officer who harbors these horrible views in the comfort of his or her own home, and you would never believe that they had these views by the conduct that they engaged in when they were in public or when they were out acting as a police officer, I would suggest that that's the least of our concerns, because there are allegations of racist policing that come into the police department all the time. These come from the community. They come from employees within the police department who report racial discrimination and racial animus that's visited on them or their colleagues. And these reports, I would suggest, are the basis for action. And, you know, unfortunately, the way the system tends to work is that those are the types of allegations that the police force wants to defend against, which, you know, when it's a member of the community, you can almost understand that from an institutional perspective. But often, even when it's a police officer complaining about the racial discrimination from another police officer, the institution tends to take the side of the person who is alleged to have engaged in misconduct, not the side of the person who's claiming to have been a victim of misconduct. And I think that's what needs to change. So I think my recommendations are to focus on conduct and make sure that when we get these complaints, obviously they need to be investigated and proper action only taken where there's evidence that a police officer did engage in misconduct. But it's what in law enforcement we otherwise call a clue, that there is something to investigate here, and that should be an opportunity for police leaders and district attorneys to start looking a little more closely at those cases that those officers bring or the behavior that they engage in. And particularly when it is another police officer who is reporting that. You know, often, and I found even in the federal government, there is this institutional, beyond the institution, law enforcement tradition of defending their own and maintaining the blue wall of silence. So what we need to do is make sure that we have strong whistleblower protections in place. And police leaders and district attorneys need to encourage whistleblowers, let them know they will be protected, and then take whatever actions are necessary to protect them. Because one thing that we've seen, and Professor Johnson mentioned a number of these cases, very often there are people in the police department who know about this before the public does. And often even the police leaders know about it, but they don't feel they have enough evidence to fire the person. So they allow the person to stay where they continue to create a risk of harm to the community. And so what we have to do is have mitigation strategies in place. Not every type of misconduct can justify a firing, but there are plenty of police jobs that don't involve interactions with the public, or that reduce those interactions or reduce the likelihood of harm that could come from those interactions. When a police officer is found to be not very effective at writing his reports, we put extra supervision on that person. We give them remedial training. There are measures that can be taken where the police department is acknowledging the problem and taking steps to mitigate it, so that they're building a record. If that does not improve the behavior, they can then take more drastic measures. And I appreciate the reference to putting police officers who are found to have engaged in this type of racist misconduct onto exculpatory disclosure lists, what are called Brady lists. And that was a recommendation I took from Professor Johnson's work in my own report, because as an FBI agent, I saw there was a Supreme Court decision called Giglio, in which somebody who had engaged in some kind of untruthful statement as an FBI agent in any kind of internal action had to be turned over to the defense. And I saw how that had a very significant impact on the FBI, where people who had a history of not telling the truth, all of a sudden were not allowed to work criminal cases. We're not allowed to do cases where they were going to be on the street, where their testimony was going to be necessary for a prosecution. So I know that can work, that the actions that these district attorneys, and I would encourage the federal government to also do this, but to match that and to make sure it's shared, that it's not just in one district, because as Professor Johnson's work also shows, often what you see is a police officer will leave one police department under this kind of cloud, but be able to get hired by another police department. Again, I look forward to the questioning, but I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this issue in public, because that's where it needs to be had.
Thank you both. And I encourage people we've got lots of questions. One question in the chat: how can you work with police unions who may stand in the way of some of these real actions being taken against officers who've engaged in misconduct? And also I think it speaks to not just sort of the conditions, but as we've seen in some of these cases, places where the process may take a very long time, the discipline process, and where it sometimes resolves in something. While there may be, Mr. German, as you said, there may be conduct that doesn't need to lead to a firing, but lots of times there are agreements or people resigning, that sort of thing. How do you work with that?
I think that's a really difficult question, because unfortunately police unions just have an incredible amount of power. I wish all unions had that much power, but they don't. And I really think that this goes back to, local governments and renegotiating those contracts with police departments. Those are, the protection that police officers get in their employment is really unlike anything that anyone else enjoys in their employment. Like if I did half the things that police officers have done and stayed on the force for, I would have been fired very quickly. And so it really comes down to renegotiating those contracts. There is a lot of due process afforded police officers, which I understand, but there has to be a limit, and it can't be impossible to fire a police officer, again, because of the reasons we talked about before. Police officers just have so much power, and they are the only people who can actually hurt me legally. And that's an issue, and we need to change that imbalance. And that really comes down to whoever, depends on the jurisdiction, how those contracts get negotiated. Sometimes it's the city council, sometimes it's the mayor, sometimes it's city manager, whoever is the one negotiating his contracts, needs to be able to trade something, more vacation days for fewer, protections in after discipline, something like that. But it right now, police unions have incredible amounts of power. And that's why I think, Mike was suggesting other things like workarounds, like, having someone just handle evidence or just answer phones, because it is so difficult to fire police officers.
And I'll just add on top of that, part of this, I think, is, and part of why this public discussion is necessary, is that there needs to be some education for these union leaders as well, because as union leaders, they represent all the rank and file, including those Black and brown police officers who are suffering under this system, and all police officers who are at risk. Because of my background, I get to speak to a lot of police audiences, and over the past 4 years, as we've seen public violence by white supremacists and far-right militant groups, that the police seem to be ignoring, and sometimes even fist bumping the individuals as they walk out of one of these rallies. That if you look at the history of white supremacy, including the recent history, white supremacists kill police officers regularly. And the fact that so many police officers were injured on January 6th, I think highlights this, that these groups are not friendly to law enforcement. They pose a risk to them. And while we could all see that risk realized on January 6th, that's happening every day within the police department when these people are engaged in their regular activities with putting their fellow officers at risk. And, again, just read these FBI reports. What they talk about is the risk to law enforcement. And I think if the unions are educated to that, they would be far more open to putting in, and this is why, again, and I keep praising this, but the transparency is key, putting these policies in place before you have a crisis, so that when action is taken, it's following a procedure that's already been agreed on. That, okay, we know in police shootings that police officers are often put on administrative duty. Well, if you're accused of some kind of racist violence, that should be the same, it's just natural to put that person on administrative duty, where if they ultimately are found guilty, they won't be able to have done more harm while the proceeding goes through. And, and particularly, I came from the FBI that doesn't have a union. And, I know how the lack of due process causes other harms that we don't want to revisit from earlier generations. So, what they're doing is important in requiring that due process. And if we get that process solidified in policy before we have a crisis, it's a lot easier to manage.
All right, so we have a lot of questions, some of which are for one of you, some are for both, but a question for you, Professor Johnson. When you testified at the congressional hearing, you talked about the fact that in 2009, the Department of Homeland Security said that the recruitment among the military by these groups was, quote, the biggest domestic terrorism threat in the United States. And what you told the Congress at the hearing was that warning had largely been unheeded. And when we came to January 6th, and you were not very far away, I assume at Georgetown, and saw that all happening, and as you've added to the chat, where over 100 officers were injured at that. And then we came to learn that lots of those folks were former military. What were you thinking at that point? Like, I know there's I've been telling you that piece, but that was probably, I would imagine, sort of the worst nightmare playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I ended up writing an article about it as well, because it was honestly writing itself in my mind, because I saw so many connections. So, we do recruit a lot of officers from the military. And so it's not a big surprise that on January 6th, we saw so many members of the military who were there who have, been led to believe in these far-right ideologies. But there's also a fair number of police officers who were present too. I think there were 47 police officers who were either at the Capitol breach or at the rally preceding the Capitol siege. And I want to speak to that because I think it's really interesting. So people who went to that rally believed one of two things: either that the election was stolen, right? They falsely believed that the election was stolen, or they didn't care and they still wanted the election results to be overturned. That there were police officers amongst that group, and there were at least 47 from what I understand, is scary, right? We shouldn't have police officers who can't separate fact from fiction, right? They have to assess threats as part of their job, or ones that don't believe in democracy, because they're the ones keeping us safe. And we saw that on January 6th, police officers were completely unprepared for what was unleashed. And I've written that I think that was due to both some explicit racial biases and some implicit ones, where the police just didn't see this largely all-white crowd to be a threat to them, and should have. I mean, these poor officers didn't have helmets. They didn't have aerosols to control the crowd, and they were vastly outnumbered. And yet there had been warnings for weeks about what was going to happen on January 6th. And so this is the way that the infiltration of these far-right ideologies imperils all of us, not just communities of color. This makes us all much less safe.
And another question is that, and I assume both of you might agree with this from your work, that election times tend to raise the level of activity on the part of these groups, like as we head into particularly a national election. And what do you think that means in terms of this kind of the need maybe to have people inside police departments that can help when you're going to ratchet up your activity? Are there things that we should be doing to sort of think about, elections are coming up? Should we be prepared for that?
So there is a history of increased white supremacist violence around elections. I think we have to put it in context. Unfortunately, we tend to be a very violent country, and we're talking about a small sliver of the criminal violence that occurs in the United States. So I think it's important that we don't overstate it and scare people away from the polls. Most of our voting is extremely safe, and it's very rare to have any kind of incident. But I think part of the problem is that law enforcement does not have a very good understanding of how these groups operate, and particularly the criminal element within them. And that's one of the larger problems, is that there's no government agency that collects objective data about white supremacist crimes. We don't know how many people white supremacists killed last year because no agency collects that data holistically. So, lacking that intelligence and lacking that data, it's very hard to put together a policy that more effectively addresses it. So, and I think one of the examples that's perhaps relevant here, and again, I'm not prejudging the specific issue that happened in Woburn, but before January 6th, we had white supremacist groups from all across the country, many with long histories of violence, led by individuals who had previously been charged and convicted of engaging in racist or other white supremacist violence, come to one small city in Virginia where they engaged in racist violence, and then dispersed again. and only one federal prosecution came out of that. And I think that's part of the problem, is that there isn't an interest in the federal government in really understanding how this movement operates. There was a Washington Post report after January 6th that indicated there were dozens of people on the terrorist watch list that were at the Capitol that day. How do dozens of people on the terrorist watch list gather at the Capitol, and the FBI doesn't have a huge group of people out there trying to understand what happened? So, we certainly have to hold our local officials responsible and make sure that there's the transparency there because they have the most direct impact on our communities. But we have to hold federal officials responsible as well, and organizing some district attorneys and police leaders to make sure the FBI is more effective at this. And most recently, I'm not sure how many people saw this. It only came out last Friday. An internal email was released by the FBI, and NBC News reported on it, where a high-level official is being alerted to the statement that a FBI employee made, that 70% of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, a week after the assault on the Capitol, were expressing sympathies for the rioters, and 75% of the entire FBI employee pool. So that is a huge problem, and it's virtually not discussed in all the reforms that we're talking about post January 6th, and I think it needs to be at the top of the list.
So,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say to your question, and I'm glad Michael went first because it gave him more time to think. I think one of the big issues that we saw in 2020 around elections were these militia groups.
Mhm.
And like Oath Keepers, 3%ers that are all, targeting police and former police officers, and a number of other ones. We saw them be fairly active in battleground states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona. That should have been a warning about what was going to happen on January 6th, but wasn't. But I think that's something that law enforcement needs to be on top of, because actually it's against the law to impersonate a police officer and organize to govern the way these groups do. Literally every state in the nation has a statute on the books that makes this illegal, but nobody's been arrested for it. A lot of police officers have taken the position that, these guys have a Second Amendment right to have their firearms, so we're not going to arrest them. But when they're an organized group and they're in uniform and they're saying they're there to enforce laws, they're actually violating the law. And I think that's something that law enforcement needs to get on top of before November, which seems impossible, but certainly before 2024.
Right. And Mr. Chairman, I was going to ask you, and you answered a little bit about, you said in 2019 that you didn't think the Justice Department and the FBI were taking these white supremacist groups seriously enough, and that it was actually organized criminal activity, and they needed to use more resources and get involved in that. Obviously, then we have things that have happened since then. We in Massachusetts have had a number of visits from these groups where they've been marching through the streets. Do you think that your warning's been heeded at all? Has there been any shift to making some inroads in this area?
So I think there are a lot of agents and analysts on the ground who are doing good work, and they could point to those cases. I think management is not accepting it as this problem as a priority, and they don't want to, reporting today that the Justice Department is complaining that they don't have the resources to continue the January 6th investigations unless they get an infusion of money from Congress. Well, while I can understand, they're prosecuting almost 900 people, that's hard, but they were also making bad choices by charging so many misdemeanor cases. There were people who committed serious felonies in front of the Capitol. Those are the people that the federal law enforcement should have resources should have been directed to. And, they can get around to the misdemeanors later, but now that they've, charged hundreds of misdemeanor cases that they have to process through the system, they're suggesting that we might have to cut this investigation short if we don't get more money. So, they can reallocate money from any other type of investigation. I would argue if this was a priority for the Justice Department and the FBI, they wouldn't be talking like that. That they would have already reallocated that money and they would be devoting a greater share of resources to these crimes, and particularly because this organized criminal activity hasn't stopped, right? These same groups, Proud Boys, militia members, are engaging in violence, threatening election officials, as we've talked about, but also threatening school boards and teachers and different parts of our community. And there doesn't seem to be any energy at the Justice Department to look at January 6th holistically, that there was violence before that led up to it and violence continuing after that they have to understand to be able to get in front of.
Another question that's coming. Can you speak to a prosecutor's obligation to keep these officers from negatively impacting cases on every level?
Oh, I'm happy to.
You look happy to speak of that.
This is my paper, KKK and the PD. The biggest recommendation in it was for prosecutors to do exactly what you've done, which is to go through making sure that officers who have this kind of reputation or have received discipline for this type of behavior, but still remain on the force, that information be turned over to the defense. But I think there's more than that, because so few cases actually make it to trial. And so just turning things over as Brady material is going to be insufficient. Brady is that case that says we have to turn over, the government has to turn over exculpatory information to the defense. But so few cases go to trial that I think that what we really need from prosecutors is to really look at any case brought by these officers. And I know that's what you're doing with this particular officer that sort of brought us together today. But the idea that cases where people were stopped based on this guy's hunch or suspicion, those cases need to be investigated. Cases where maybe he didn't testify, but he helped fill out police paperwork, that needs to be done. And I think those are very squarely fall under that Brady case law, and I think should be turned over. But I would love to see prosecutors go even further. And I know there's there's probably some constraints for doing this kind of work, but I think prosecutors should be investigating police officers just like they do any other witness. So let's say a complainant comes in and says that they were robbed, but their story, they didn't call the police right away. Maybe their story seems a little fishy. And so prosecutor is going to look into this person and do some digging around to figure out whether this is a trustworthy person or not. I'd love to see prosecutors do that with the police department, knowing that this is a huge problem, not just explicit racism on police forces, but homophobia, transphobia, misogyny. We have so many categories, unfortunately, where we see people treat others unfairly. I would love to see prosecutors kind of figure out who those problem officers are. And, people often know, having done this work for a long time, I know the defense bar certainly knows who these problem officers are. So I'm sure the prosecutors do. So I'd love to see more of that. And then I think there's lots of things that police departments can do. But I'd love to see a little more probing by prosecutors of the police officers, because once a police officer isn't useful to the prosecutor, the police department's not going to use them anymore either in any major way. And that's going to keep them from interacting with the public, which at the end of the day is my biggest concern. These officers who harbor hatred in their heart shouldn't be interacting with the public.
Did you want to add anything, Mr. Jim? You want Tyler?
You're muted.
Yeah. I thank you. I think it's important for prosecutors to get involved to have at least a step away from the self-interest, right? A police agency gets a report of a problem officer. They don't want to make a big deal out of it because then it makes them look bad. So, it's easier to cover up a problem than find it. So at least there's a little bit of independence. But I think it's also important for prosecutors not to pretend that it doesn't often, that white supremacy and racism doesn't also infect their own departments. And, if there's a problem officer and that problem officer is, engaging in enough behavior that the defense bar knows about it, the prosecutors working with that officer know too. They might not have evidence that this person is engaged in racist misbehavior or some kind of criminal activity, but they probably have a guess that there's not something quite right here. And, making sure that your office and that every district attorney office knows that it's your responsibility. Part of your job is to make sure that you are reporting that appropriately and not using information from witnesses who may be tainted by bias. So I would encourage prosecutors taking a driver's seat on this issue, because I think they have more power than even the average police chief to enact significant reforms.
So 2 follow-ups to that. One, and both for what both of you mentioned, but we're joined tonight by some of our police chiefs. What are some things that you think police departments can be doing?
I think go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead. Go ahead.
I think to a large degree, this is a leadership issue. So I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope that some of this is and the writing that I've done and that Professor Johnson does is helpful, because it's a problem that again doesn't just harm the community, it harms the department. And the first thing I would say is make sure your officers know that if they know about this and don't report it, that's a black mark against them, and that if they report it, they will be protected, that they will be encouraged to report and protected once they do, and that this type of behavior will not be tolerated to any degree. And that's a message that you can put out tomorrow, and you can help, work with, whether it's the police union or the city manager or whoever you have to work with, to make sure that you have policies in place that are bulletproof. So when a case does come up, it's already breached. We already know how to handle this case because we've set policy and worked out all the difficult decisions we've made about what to do with the person while the investigation is proceeding, and what activity with a white supremacist group is something we can terminate somebody for versus demote them and put them in a place where they can't harm anyone. That's all worked out in the light of day before we have a crisis.
I completely agree. I completely agree with everything Mike said. And I would just add that I think there's some other sort of more proactive things that police departments can do. So most police officers go through background checks. And I think, if you don't have one, you should be doing them. And then they should also be looking for bias. Background checks can be as thorough as you want them to be. And so asking questions about bias, asking questions about all types of bias and extremism, I think is really important. I would also suggest that we don't just stick to background checks. We all know that we're really different people at the age of 20 than we are at the age of 45, whether we like it or not. And we often become more political as we age. And so doing periodic background checks of people who are on the force, that's an important thing to do too. And making sure that that's something that's a condition of employment. I'd also say that police officers' work can be monitored. So between body-worn cameras, text messages, and emails, all of which take place on the job. And so employers have no problem getting into those files, looking for keywords associated with racial animus, sexism, homophobia. A lot of the sort of biggest scandals that I've written about have been officers texting that got caught. There's a huge scandal out of North Carolina where officers are literally dreaming of a race war and talking about killing Black people. And it all just got caught because of an audit on the body-worn camera system. They had their body-worn cameras on. So these are things that police departments can do to get rid, keep those views completely to themselves. They're often talking to their partners, for 8 hours a day. And so that's information that police officers really already have. They just need to look through it.
And if I can add one more, is for the police chiefs to work together. If there's a problem officer who is even leaving your department voluntarily because somebody has reported something that hasn't hit the media, let the other police chiefs know, give them a heads up, and make sure that there isn't any place in law enforcement for these people to feel comfortable, because again, they pose a threat to your workforce, and it's your responsibility to protect your workforce.
And Mr. Durbin, this question's for you. Can you talk a bit more about what you learned while doing your undercover work with these groups? And they're asking two specific things. What did you learn about the triggering events that might have caused radicalization? And second of all, what did you learn that made it clear there was a link that they were seeking to law enforcement?
The most interesting thing, and I grew up in the U.S. military. My dad was an Army officer, and we moved all around the country. And there's a perception that this is a problem in the South, but it's everywhere. And one of the things that I learned was how prevalent it was. Right. And even the words we use to describe it, right? We tend to talk about it as a form of extremism, right? Somebody who would hold these views, they're extremist. But they were mainstream in the 1950s and 60s, right? These are not ideologies and philosophies that are fringe in our society. They're foundational to our society. And we have to understand how the civil rights movement was very effective in somewhat pushing the public expression of these ideas to the margins. But, as we've seen over the last few years, once it becomes okay, that people in authority start to use racist language, all of a sudden it looks like it's everywhere. And, people would say to me, wow, how is this ideology expanding so much? And I would say, do you think somebody 2 years ago wasn't racist, but decided now to become racist? Or do you think they were racist, they just weren't publicly expressing it? I think probably more of the latter. I have significant concerns with this concept of radicalization and the way that the government uses that to target people who are expressing themselves rather than focusing on people who are doing harm. A lot of the people who were making bombs for this skinhead group that I was undercover with, they weren't really very ideological at all. They liked making bombs. And they found a group that appreciated their bomb-making ability and was willing to put it to use. So, I think, again, a better understanding of how these groups actually work is really important to law enforcement, to understand that if they want to stop the violence, they have to focus on the violence and not the ideology. So, I don't really buy the idea that there are necessarily triggering events. What we see regularly is these are people who had been in trouble before. People had reported them before. And, in some of the recent attacks in Buffalo, for example, that threats had been made and reported to law enforcement. And, the proper measures not taken to make sure that there's enough follow-up to ensure that that problem doesn't get worse. And we've seen that in many events. So, I'm happy if somebody wants to reach out to me for more detailed information about that. And the way it was expressed in the groups I was in, part of it was hard to parse. You could imagine, like any organized criminal activity, people are very closed about sharing a whole lot of information, that they work on a need to know basis. Luckily, they didn't know what I was doing with the information they were giving me. But so it was always hard to parse what was somebody bragging about having law enforcement contacts versus somebody who could actually reach out to touch. We did have people who were former law enforcement who, of course, because they're former law enforcement, they most likely do have people in law enforcement, but those cases weren't focused on that activity. But we've seen many cases where members of law enforcement were subject of FBI investigations for this. So, again, part of it is the groups obviously have an interest in having friends in law enforcement. Part of it is some people in law enforcement were enamored with these groups before they joined. Some meet somebody on the job who says, hey, what do you think of these ideas? Read this pamphlet, and they get dragged into it. And, as one of the things that I think is difficult for law enforcement is that one of the tactics these groups use is regularly changing their names. So if they get notorious for some criminal act, they'll reform under a different name. And we saw this with this group, I'm blanking on the name of the group.
Identity Europa.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the one that just marched through Boston.
Patriot Front.
Patriot Front.
Yeah.
Was originally called Vanguard America. And in fact, it was a person associated with Vanguard America who ended up killing Heather Heyer at that event. So that event made that name toxic. So they just rebrand under another name. And, we're doing similar activity and engaging in alleged criminal activity across the country. And that's why it was frustrating after the Boston March, where an FBI official went to the press and said, well, we can't open a case until we have a criminal predicate, which actually isn't true. Their authorities are quite broad, but also there's plenty of criminal predicate, right? The members of this group had been arrested all across the country. So, I don't understand what the blind spot is that doesn't let them understand this is organized criminal activity, just like any other organized type crime.
Another question, what systemic changes would you recommend in policing that might discourage members of this group from wanting, people who hold these views, I guess, also, who wanting to join the police department? Are there those kinds of changes?
Yeah. I'm not a police abolitionist, but I do think that police forces are too large. And I think that the less contact police have with the community that's non-consensual, the better. And so that's going to reduce these incidents. It's also going to mean that people who want to control the goings and comings of people of color it's going to be less attractive to them. So for example, nobody likes a speed camera, but you know what? They're a lot better than getting pulled over. So things like that, sort of right sizing police departments, I think would be the biggest change. We talked about what I think about background checks and really going through officers' emails. Those are some other changes. But we also need to look at who our police officers are. White men are vastly overrepresented in every police department across the country. And even where we've seen some gains or there's been more Black officers, a lot of those Black officers who were hired in the 80s and 90s, they're retiring. There's not a lot of Black officers that are lining up to replace them. And so we're going to see police departments maybe not get whiter because there may be Asian and Latino people to replace them, but they're not going to get any Blacker. They're going to, and that's going to be an issue because people of color are less likely to be white supremacists. It's probably not a big surprise. And so I think we need to do a better job at recruiting more diverse officers. And I think particularly women. Women make up about 13% of police forces. That's not very many. We're 50% of the population. And we know that the presence of just one female officer on a scene reduces the chance for violence. And so I think we absolutely need more women on police forces.
And I would also take a hard look at revamping police training. I found it fascinating. After the George Floyd video was published, there were a lot of police officials going on TV saying that's not the way we're trained. But all through the Black Lives Matter protests, what you saw is that exact same arrest methodology used over and over and over again, where 3 or 4 officers are kneeling on a person, including on their head and neck, as they arrest them, and putting them in painful positions that make them writhe, and then yell, stop resisting, as you're putting a knee in the small of their back, so that you can justify meting out some punishment. So somebody is training them in that tactic, because it was repeated all across the country. And I think we need to get better control of police training and better analysis of what is a threat to police, right? For years, we've been hearing police talk about the threat of violence to them, when historically, with the exception of this year has been particularly violent for police officers, but it's actually been at historic lows, the level of police violence against police. And I think if police knew that, they would feel a lot less threatened when they're out on the street, and a lot less reactive. To teach them that no, there are ways to de-escalate the violence is really important, and to understand that part of their role is to engage with the community in positive ways. So often what we see in police training is this warrior cop training, that like they're military people in hostile country. No, this is your community. And obviously there are things like residential laws and things like that I think could aid it. I know that's a complex discussion, but if you feel that community is your community, you feel more like a protector than a warrior in that community.
Yeah, and thinking about those ads that we do for police. I mean, so many places, I don't know, Massachusetts does or what Woburn does, but it's often like this SWAT team kind of look. That's going to attract officers that want to be at war with their community. Having a more like community protector, community servant, people handing apples to school children, that's going to attract a different person than the SWAT team image.
Right. And it's interesting, there was some news because an FBI agent who was on the SWAT team just got fired because he refused to participate in a SWAT raid against a January 6th, a person alleged to engage in January 6th. And while I disagree with that person's ideological position, I agree we don't need SWAT teams for every arrest. And unfortunately, that's become, again, this very violent arrests that, when I was an FBI agent in the 1980s, and we did our arrest training, it was, here's how you arrest somebody. You reach out your hand and you say, hi, my name's Mike. And when they shake your hand, you put a handcuff on it, right? That you don't have to make it a violent confrontation when you arrest somebody. But so often what we see today is these types of conflicts come out of police aggression that wasn't necessary.
Professor Johnson, you were very intentional when we began tonight in saying that regardless of the topic we were going to be discussing, that you believe that the vast majority of people who became police officers did that for the right reason, and you included in that number members of your own family. Does that belief inspire some of your view on why it's so important to talk publicly about these issues?
Absolutely. My husband was briefly a police officer in Massachusetts, and a lot of his family are involved in law enforcement. And I had an uncle on my maternal side who was the DEA for years. So absolutely. And when I chose to become a public defender, I remember my uncle really like challenging me, like, He couldn't believe that I was a defense attorney. He thought I was defending the public and that I was a DA, and I had to explain him a few times. But absolutely, I want that field to be something that people want to do again, and they're proud of doing, and where these police officers are really like our friends and allies, and not someone that we're afraid of anymore. I was actually in Massachusetts. I was in Lenox, and there was a concert happening, and the officers were actually walking people across the street for our protection. I was just shocked. I hadn't seen that. So different than what we see police do in Washington, D.C., right? Like if they saw, you might get a jaywalking ticket, but it's just the opposite. So I absolutely think that this is a profession that could be restored, where there can be community trust again. But unfortunately, I think we're a long way from that.
And it's interesting, when I would, there's a police aversion to the concept of defunding or abolition. But afterwards, I would have conversations with officers where they would say, the problem is we're being asked to go on police calls to people with mental illness, and we're not trained for that. And we're being asked to police homeless people who aren't committing crimes. They're just on the street and an annoyance to somebody. We're being asked to do all these things. And I think if police agencies engage on these topics and express that we can come to a situation where we say, okay, this, defunding the police isn't a threat to police, it's an assistant to police. Because if you had social workers out there who could take care of the housing problem, if you had mental health counselors who could take care of those mental health calls, that would free you up to do the things you are trained to do, and in law enforcement and investigations and responding to criminal actions, rather than having to do that kind of social policing that I don't think you want to do, and certainly your officers feel unprepared for.
So I think we have time for our last two questions. First one for you, Mr. German. You've talked a little bit about the use of the internet, that while some people believe the internet helps to spread all of these views and that people go down these rabbit holes of learning these things, you've talked about how it can be a plus for law enforcement. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, and especially having worked undercover in these groups before 9/11, they had elaborate communication methodologies long before we had an internet. They know how to communicate with themselves. They've been around in this country for a long time, and they have networks that can get them around the country. So I think it's easy to overstate, because internet communication and social media is so new, that's the threat. But it's what my parents always warned me about when I was a kid. It's a permanent record. And often what we see when these groups are found out, it's through leaks from these platforms that they engage on. I mean, I mentioned that there weren't federal conspiracy cases being brought out of Charlottesville by the FBI, but regular lawyers were able to use leaked Discord chats from the organizers of the Unite the Right rally to hold them civilly responsible for that crime. The FBI doesn't have to, and regular law enforcement, they don't have to wait until there's a leak, right? They have very effective tools for getting that kind of information if they have an interest in doing it. And my concern is there wasn't an interest in unraveling the conspiracy by law enforcement, and instead they abandoned that. And that's why years later, we're still only finding out people who participated in it through public members who are engaging in those investigations, not through law enforcement channels or through criminal prosecution.
Professor Johnson, you talked about your scholarship and the idea of groupthink that often exists in law enforcement. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it plays into this problem?
Sure. It's a cognitive bias that a lot of us have. But when we're in a group, we tend to align our thought processes with other people in our group, right? So things that you thought were perfectly normal when you were a kid that you later found out, oh, that's kind of weird that we did that, those kinds of things. And so that happens in law enforcement. You know, they have a shared worldview, and often will come to hold a lot of the same views about things that might be different than the way the rest of the community holds those views. And so, you know, a certain neighborhood is bad, or you know, this is a neighborhood that needs to be monitored. It may not actually be an objectively true thing, that there's anything special about that neighborhood, but it can, those sorts of viewpoints can be entrenched. This happens to prosecutors. This happens in a lot of places where there's a shared goal, and it's just important for people to be aware that those biases exist so they can question their own thinking. And I often say that when we're talking about these kinds of reforms like we are today, that it's sometimes really helpful to actually have outsiders come be the ones to do those things, because things that might sound normal to you in that role, let's say you're a police chief and so you've hung out with all these guys and you know, it all seems perfectly normal. It might be good to have an outsider be the one making these assessments, because groupthink might be at play. But unfortunately, there's a lot of cognitive biases, and that's one of them that happens to infect police officers and other groups.
And just as we close out, you know, these are such incredibly painful episodes when they come to light in a community. Can you just talk a little bit about why you think it's, when everybody's tendency might be to let this go behind us and let it end more quickly, why it's really important in the remediating that trust that has to exist to have these conversations, to be transparent about it?
I'm so glad you asked that, and I think Mike and I both agree that transparency is everything to get trust from the community. These sorts of incidents are incredibly painful, as you say, but it's much worse to sweep them under the rug. We know these have enormous costs for individuals who may be the victims of these officers, for entire communities that feel like these police are sometimes an occupying force in their communities, and that inflicts a tremendous amount of trauma and stress, not just on the people that are the targets of the police investigations, but also their children, their grandparents, people who are completely innocent in these power struggles between the community and the police. And I think we need to get back to a place where we see police as public servants. And I think police should see themselves as public servants rather than warriors, as Mike said. And I think it's so important when we think about the human cost, and then there's a huge financial cost. You know, lawsuits cost towns tremendous amounts of money that not everyone knows that when police officers get sued, it's not the police officer that pays, it's the taxpayer. And so getting to the bottom of problem officers and making sure they're off the force, or at least doing very little harm, is so important. People always want to talk about how it's one bad apple, but remember, the rest of that saying is one bad apple spoils the bunch. And so we really need to rid ourselves of problem police officers.
And I would agree. And again, that this is a risk to all the good police officers that Professor Johnson mentioned that I worked with. It harms their ability to do their job effectively. So it's really important to take these cases on straightforwardly, and also to make it clear to the department, to everyone in the department, that it won't be tolerated. And you know, once that message is solidified and that you expect people to report that kind of misconduct, I think that you know, you're enabling that good part of your police department to do good work. And I think that's what's essential.
Well, thank you both. We owe you a great debt, both for coming, for being with us tonight, for sharing your knowledge and giving us really so much to think about as we navigate these days moving forward to address this incident here. Thank you both. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. We are making available lots of the reports and scholarship that you heard talked about, and we'll make that available on our website with the recording of tonight's event as well. So thank you all. Be well. Take care.